Hello.
Hello.
Welcome. My name is Georgia Court, and I am the proprietor here. And I'm very happy to have my friend Herb Keyser with us today. And a lot of you who are regulars here are probably wondering why this strange setup in this room. I don't know. Were you wondering, Mary Lou? She looks like, well, what do I care? Right? And the reason is there's a young man who works for us whose name is Ren. And Ren produces what's called Gothic radio theater. And he had a performance here last night of Treasure Island, and he's doing another one later today up here for Treasure Island, and he fills the place, and this is how he sets up for his audience. And if you have never experienced one of these are fun. He brings in actors who do the equivalent of readers' theater. And in this case, he rewrites the scripts. He writes the scripts, so he kind of rewrites the story to make it flow. He has actors read, and they're live, and he does radio sound effects during it. So it's a lot of fun. He has done things like Dracula and Frankenstein, but today he's doing Treasure Island because it's a family show. So he's doing a little earlier. So if you're interested in that, that's going to be at 5 o'clock today. There is a ticket fee. I honestly don't remember what it is. Do you remember, Bryn?
$25.
Okay, $25 to do that.
And there's wine included.
And he includes wine. Okay, so if that's an incentive. Just wanted to let you know about that because that's kind of one of the more unusual things that we do, and we've been doing it for a while now, and he gets good audiences for it. I think people have a lot of fun. So this morning, though, this afternoon, we have with us Herb Keyser. Herb is a friend of mine from Chautauqua, and I really met Herb when he was my landlord for one summer, and it was a lot of fun because we were, my partner, he and I were downstairs, and Herb was above us, and Herb is the guy, if you know Chautauqua, who for many, many years baked lemon tarts and sold them to support the institution. So Herb was upstairs baking lemon tarts and brownies, and when they were a little crumbly, he'd bring them down to us.
You can't sell those.
What are you going to do with them?
Yeah, thank you, Herb. So in any case, this is how I came to know Herb. So I'm very pleased that he's here with us. But in his own bio that he wrote, he mentions that he's 91 years old. I'm not so sure that that's relevant because who would know? But in any case, he is a retired obstetrician. He's been writing books for 40 years. And of his 7 books, the most recent one is Finding Barbara, which is about a memoir wherein he remembers the life with his beloved, very beloved wife. And his books are generally, I don't think all, but generally self-published. And part of the discussion today, when we get into it, is really about that process and how that works and how he came to do it. But I want to get started first with Herb spending 5 minutes or so letting you know basically about the book.
The one thing I can correct on that is that before this book, my books were not self-published. They were all published by everything from the smallest to really some of the largest publishers in the world. One book was published by the Hal Leonard Corporation, the largest music book publisher in the world, and the rest are all published by different publishers around the country.
Herb, if you could hold your microphone out like that.
Like this?
Yeah.
Okay, hear me better?
Yeah.
This memoir was started like no memoir should be written. I had previously written 6 books before this, not counting scientific literature. And there was no plan to write a memoir. I had been married to Barbara for 40 years. She was the most phenomenal woman that I had ever known in my entire life. She was smart. She was a great athlete. We would ski double black diamond runs all over the world. She was a good enough tennis player to beat me all the time. She was a swimmer who was swimming a half mile every other day just before she became ill at the age of 87. She was a divine chef. Everybody who knew her knew that to come over there and have a meal was spectacular. And she was on top of that, the sweetest, kindest person you could possibly know. And she had come to San Antonio before I did. She was there 25 years before I came there, and I was told that when she arrived, people said that she was the most beautiful woman in all of San Antonio.
Yeah, here's her photo.
It's
This is not
hard to
hyperbole.
believe when you see what she looked like.
Right.
In December of 2019, we had just returned from our 70-something, I think 75th cruise around the world, where I've been lecturing all the time on American musical theater, and it was based on my book, Geniuses of the American Musical Theater. Barbara suddenly developed abdominal symptoms. After 6 months of traveling back and forth, including the Mayo Clinic twice, she was getting weaker, weaker, and weaker, and suddenly she died with no diagnosis and no treatment. I don't believe I have to tell you how devastated I was about that, and I just was on the verge of insanity and went around the country trying to find somebody who knew what had killed her. And finally, a doctor at Harvard, at Dana-Farber, identified from all the material that I had accumulated that she had one of the rarest autoimmune diseases. So for 3-4 months, I barely did anything except cry every day, connecting with no one, and then I decided I had to write a memoir about her. I did nothing else for another year, and when it was done, I sent it off to my editor. It was 850 pages long. He sent it back to me and said, essentially one word, no. He said, no one is going to read a book by you that's 850 pages long. Even though it hadn't come out yet, I'm not Barbara Streisand with her 1,000-page autobiography. And he said, besides that, you've written the wrong book. You've written a book that is filled with anger, hostility, frustration, depression about what's happened. He said, you need to rewrite this book in about 300 pages and make it a love story. And so I started all over, and for another year I wrote. My editor suggested that I read 2 other memoirs. I don't know what, maybe many of you have read these memoirs. Joan Didion's The Year of Magical Thinking, and Mary Carr's The Liar's Club. I read them both, and I believe that helped me to understand what I should be doing. But then I read a book that's not listed as a memoir, but to me it really was. It was called These Precious Days by Anne Patchett, in which she tells in a number of essays different parts of her life. I got more from that, I think, than the other books. Some of the essays were funny, some were sad, but they had a theme that brought them all together. One of them in there, if you get to read that book, is called A Talk to the Association of Graduate School Deans in Humanities, which gives a wonderful description of what it's like to be a writer. And for those of you who like to write, it's an essay really worth reading. If you're looking for answers from me to how to write a memoir, remember, though I have written a memoir and 6 other books, all of it has to be taken with a grain of salt. I'm trained as a physician, not as an author. The best thing I can tell you about my writing is when I was a freshman in college and I had a required English course. I was not interested in going to college at all. I hated where I was, and I rarely showed up for classes. And he realized that and wasn't too wild about it. So one day, not too friendly a conversation, he said to me, Keyser, I wasn't showing up, what do you plan to do for your life? And I said, I was 18 years old. I said, I haven't the slightest idea. And he said, well, do me a favor, don't be a writer. So, most of my books were published, as I said, by numerous different small publishers, and usually by a very limited number of readers. And that is the story, in case you're not aware of it, for almost all writers. It's only a handful that are being read in great numbers. Most people do not get read very much. I guess my book about Broadway was the one that got read the most, except for my cookbook about lemon tarts, which people bought and said, and it was a book that had 14 recipes in it, but people said they loved the book even more than the recipes, that I told a story about the restaurant that it came from and the neighborhood and everything in the background, and they said they used it as a travel guide in Paris. So this is what I've learned over those years, and that is searching for a publisher or an agent is about the same as being hit by lightning. Your chances are almost zero. You can barely get anybody to even respond to any inquiries you make. When you write something, find a theme and use that as a framework for the entire book. Keep your book a limited length, which I learned with this book, not 850 pages. And the same thing can be said for your sentences. Keep them a limited length. Long sentences in multiple parts, celebrated by multiple commas, are just not sentences. They are death sentences. They're difficult to follow and boring for the reader. Be clear and concise and descriptive as possible. Find a way to make some of it humorous, even if it's a sad book. Find some way to introduce humor into it. While you write it, hoping that people read it, the most important thing you have to understand is that you're writing the book for yourself. And it's because of something that you feel you have to do. And if no one else is interested in it, then publish it yourself. Finally, and most important, find in the process, a joy while you're working on it. And so much so that while you're writing, you just don't ever want to stop writing. And if you can accomplish that, you don't need me to say good luck. You've already won the first prize. And I'll take whatever questions you want to ask.
Yeah. I have a few prepared questions, I think, for Herb, and then we'll open it up to the audience. The book started out as 890 pages. I think at that point you even asked me to read it, and I said, maybe not. Although I enjoyed this book actually tremendously, I really did. But the question for me is, this is about less than half that length, and that meant that you had to make a lot of decisions about what to leave out. What did you leave out, and why? How did you go through that process?
Okay, a big part of the original version dealt with how we met and got married. My wife was married at the time to one of the wealthiest men in San Antonio, a mean, cruel, horrible person. She had been separated several times. We met by accident at a medical meeting, and after the first few minutes, just a few minutes, I was already madly in love. It was not mutual. As bad as her marriage was, she intended to go back to that and somehow salvage it. We lived 1,500 miles apart, and I wrote letters to her every single day, which she kept. And I still have in my possession the 7,000 pages of letters that I wrote to her over the next 2 years. So the first part of the initial book had a lot of the material in those letters, which had everything. There were more than 100 poems in there. There were stories in there, fairy tales. I would sit in labor and delivery by myself and write letters that were 30 and 40 pages long, which were really short stories that had nothing to do with her or me or anything like that. I just writing to her and writing to her and writing to her. In subsequent years, when people asked why she married me, she would say, well, it really wasn't fair. She said, he wrote and he wrote and he wrote, and he never would let up on me. And there was no way I could say no to him. So a big portion that was removed was that. There's still, I guess there are about 20 or 30 poems still in there, and portions of the letters. But I just then took those letters and shrunk them down to the point where you can understand what was going on in our lives, and how this romance was proceeding 1,500 miles apart.
Well, as you were reading your introduction, you made a comment, and I'm curious about this. This is also related to what did you decide to leave out and why. That the original person who looked at it said to you, "This is an angry book."
Right.
So what was angry? There's a little bit of that in there now.
I was angry about medical.
Right.
About
so
what happened to her medically. And
so
I was
what? How much?
frustrated about
So you left
losing
that out.
her. I was depressed about losing her. So there were a lot of parts that were just black, right? And he encouraged me to take as much of that out as I could while still retaining the story about what happened.
I see. Okay, so it's related to the medical issues. Interesting.
After all, she died undiagnosed and untreated, and of a disease that was very, very rare, but treatable if diagnosed. And there were people who would know what that disease was, but we never found them.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to talk about the process also of writing. Now we're going to focus on the self-published piece of this rather than the books you've had published otherwise. And there's a big process to this. Not only do you have to write it, but it has to be copy edited, it has to be published, things have to be designed. I mean, it is a long process. So, first of all, did you use a copy editor? And
Yeah, the editor who, was doing that. Actually, it was a small publishing house, very small. Just she and her husband, but she was an editor as well for many people, and so they accomplished many of those things for me that I did not have the expertise to do. I did the cover, but everything else they copy edited it for me, and all the details of contacting, I guess the Library of Congress to get numbers and everything. I didn't do any of that. I didn't have to.
so they did. So how did you find the people who did that for you then? What was that process like?
It was unusual. I was lecturing on cruise ships, and as an aside for fun, she was lecturing on cruise ships, not about that, but she was an artist as well, and she was teaching art classes on Crystal, and I was lecturing about Broadway. And so, as two lecturers on board, we got to know each other and became dear friends, and I'm still very close friends with them. But I guess, it just can be tricky to find someone to help you through. I certainly did not have the training or the background to be able to do any of the rest of it.
Yeah, well, I can say for a fact, because I've seen, as many of you could probably imagine, a lot of self-published books come through, and I certainly can't read all of them, but we often take looks at them. And I have to say that those books are so often so laden with minor things like typos. You would not
Right.
believe how how full of these things they are, even by the most educated people who have written this. And one reason is that when you look at your own work, and
You see it wrong.
you don't see it. You have to have an outside person, totally separate, doesn't know you, doesn't know anything about you, doesn't know anything about the work, to take a look at it.
Well, it's amazing, even in books from the biggest publishers, every once in a while,
Yeah.
you'll see a word
You'll still see one,
misspelled.
right?
And how many people may have gone through that, up to that stage, and everybody has missed it?
Yeah, we see a lot of ARCs here too. That's an advanced reader copy, and these are books that come from major publishers. And they generally get to us 4 to 6 months before they're actually published. And once again, we don't read all of them. But, you know, when I read those, it's amazing how much you find like that. And that's why they send out the advanced reader copy, because they want other people to take a look at it, because you find a lot of that, a lot of that stuff.
I had an account at a bank, which the title underneath it was separate property. And finally I sent a letter to the bank. I said, I'd feel a lot safer leaving my money with you if I knew you knew how to spell separate.
Right, things like that. It's really interesting. So, talk about the book, just the physical book itself. You know, the cover, you've talked about that you selected a photo of Barbara, a photo that you had taken, which is a beautiful, and I think it's a beautiful
The
cover.
rest of the cover was done by that editor.
By that editor. The typeface inside, it's very readable. Did you weigh in on that? Did you just allow them
They
to
did.
choose that?
They
Okay.
did.
Because that's another issue that I find often when people do their self-published books and they go through a service like Amazon has a service, for example. And you would be surprised at how unreadable some of the typefaces are that people
But
choose.
this editor and her husband were also, as I say, minor publishers.
Right.
So they had background in that.
So that's, and
What is the
that point
typeface?
is you need to find
The right
someone
person.
like that. Don't do it yourself, please. Yeah,
What is the typeface?
I'm not sure, do you remember? It's a serif.
What's that?
What is the typeface? It's a serif typeface. But I don't think that is it mentioned in the book? What
Ask me a
exactly what is
question
it?
about obstetrics.
Yeah, it doesn't, most books actually at the end will talk about the typeface that was used. This one doesn't have that information in it, so it's hard for me to say.
Yeah,
really.
sometimes I read constantly, and you'll see a lot of really fine books where they'll give you some background on what the typesetting is and where
Yeah,
it comes from.
yeah, because it's important for readability, it really is. Okay, now I'm gonna go to the publishing house. Did you use a service or did you use these independent people?
I used those then independently, but they used Amazon, so they just sent everything off to Amazon.
Well, the reason I bring that up is the other kind of a little piece of advice for those of you, and how many of you in here are thinking about really writing a book? Yeah, I figure is the one of the important things that we learned, you and I, because we couldn't sell your books here, is that you need to be sure that your book is available through a service called Ingram. Ingram is a major distributor of books. All the independent bookstores, Barnes & Noble, everybody can get your book if it's published, if it's distributed, not published by, but distributed through Ingram. So you cannot do that through Amazon. They will not permit it. So Ingram itself has a service to do this, but you don't have to use that. If you're using independent publishers or independent copywriters or independent people to help you put this book together, they can still get it into the Ingram system. So just be aware of that. That's really kind of an important thing.
The other thing I mentioned about that is if you were lucky enough to get some major publisher doesn't guarantee anything. I had books published by Time Warner, by the Hal Leonard Corporation. I traveled across the country at arrangements that were made for me to speak at bookstores all over. And one of the things that would just drive all of us crazy is I'd come to some city and come to the bookstore and the books hadn't shown up. And we go there and talk about a book. And this is with a major publisher. There's so much inefficiency. I don't know whether that's improved at all or not.
Well, I hate to say this, but the inefficiency may have been with the bookseller. Quite.
Could have been.
Yeah, quite frankly, because, you know, one of the things that we have learned here over the years, and it's now 13 years, I think, that we've been in business, is how to order books so they get here on time. Has it ever happened that they haven't arrived? Yes, but very, very rarely.
Yeah, well, it wasn't
Yeah.
rare in my situation,
Right.
but I think maybe that, just what you say, it had nothing to do with
Yeah.
the distributor, but with the bookseller.
It could be, and some publishers, depending on the publisher, are slower than others if you go directly to the publisher. I have a couple of friends who, they're Chautauquans actually, who have novels published by good publishers, but small publishers. And when one goes to try to get those books in so you can sell them, you've got to allow a lot of lead time. So be aware of that also. If you are lucky enough to find a publisher, be aware of what their distribution is like. How quickly can they turn out a book for you? Because these days, most publishers, unless you're Random House and you're publishing a major author, you know, they're not going to print 1,000 of your books. They're pretty much going to do print on demand. That's just the nature of the beast right now. So you have to make sure that they have enough time to do that, and that you have that conversation with them, that you understand how long that's going to take. So that's another issue to think about. But
All the work behind any book, though, for me, came to the greatest realization with my book about Broadway, which, as I said, was my biggest seller, and by the Hal Leonard Corporation. Now, I was just overwhelmed by what happened with that book. I wrote all the text of that book. That's all. I wrote the text of it. When the book came out, it was spectacular. Not because of the text, because it had photographs and layout and everything. It was such a gorgeous book that it sold very well. I don't know whether you've ever had a copy of it here.
I don't think so. How long ago was that published?
15 years ago. Geniuses in the American Musical Theater, and the book is just beautiful. But I had nothing to do with any of that. I had only the text, and they assembled this thing in such a great way.
Yeah. It's wonderful to have a really good publisher.
Oh my God.
It makes a difference. Yes.
What made you decide to self-publish this on Amazon?
Well, first of all, I came to the realization that there were not many people interested in my life or my wife. We were not famous in any way, and that trying to find a publisher when I was almost 90 when I started this, I didn't think I would survive long enough for that. And so that's how I decided to self-publish. And then I spoke to my friends who I knew from the cruise ship who were minor publishers, and they said that they would help me work this through, and that the actual printing would be done by Amazon, and they would be listed as the publishers. But they were not a publishing group that had the ability to distribute books or anything like that.
No. Oh, there's a question in the back. Yeah.
So it sounds like if you go down the Amazon pathway, you don't get any other distribution channels except for Amazon.
Correct.
And that has to happen by people going into Amazon and going directly to your book.
Correct.
But so if you're going to self-publish, that's the channel that you're sort of saying is the way to go, because the other way to go is impossible. It's impossible to find an agent, and it's impossible to find a publisher. Is that pretty much
No,
true?
that's, I think Herb was saying that, and I think this is probably true, it's so difficult to find a publisher that if you really want to get something out, and pretty typically like a memoir you want to leave for your family, or a book of poems you want to do, you may very well go the self-published route. But Amazon is not the only game in town. It's one game in town, and it's not a game you want to play,
Okay.
because you won't get distributed other than through Amazon. As I mentioned, Ingram itself has a publishing arm, but you don't need to use them. You may very well find somebody in your
Okay,
neighborhood.
So that part's not impossible. That part is not impossible.
No.
Say to find a publisher in that way, that's
Yeah.
not impossible.
No, right, to self-publish is pretty easily done, actually.
Okay.
Right.
And you can have your, one important note, you can publish through any other, self-publish, not through Amazon, and still have your book available on Amazon.
On Ingram, right, and that's
on
key.
Ingram. So you can have both.
Yeah, you
Go
can.
through Amazon, you can only be sold on Amazon.
That's correct, and Ingram just happens to be one of those people you could use.
Right.
You don't have to use them. But it's only Amazon that does not allow you to be distributed any other way.
Well, I didn't choose Amazon.
Yeah.
It's just that my editor knew that they did this, and she went ahead with it. I have to tell you, what's interesting is that I have no publicity, no PR, no way for anybody to know anything about this book. But Amazon sends me a royalty of about one book a month. I mean, I have no idea who's buying this book from them, but if you go on Amazon, maybe they go on Amazon and, and they see this cover and decide to buy about a book a month. It's not exactly what you want to do if you're trying to survive as a writer.
Right. Yeah, it's a long way to get to the New York Times bestseller list that way. Right. That's for
But
sure.
it'll get you quickly to a single cup of coffee.
Yeah, right. That's true. Maybe, right, maybe.
Georgia, there's a question for you.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, when you were in Barbara with all this written material,
I'm sorry.
when you were bombarding Barbara with all this written material, when you were sending her all this material, when you were recording her, and sending her all this material you were writing, what was your occupation?
When I was,
Are you a very fast writer?
Yeah,
Or were
I'll-
you taking many hours?
I'll repeat the question. The question is, when you were writing all these letters to
Right.
Barbara, what was your occupation? How'd you find time to write all these
well,
letters?
all the time, I was an obstetrician, and I was an obstetrician. In my own practice, I didn't practice the way most obstetricians do. Call me when she's ready to deliver. I would go to the hospital as soon as the patient went to the hospital, and I would stay there during the entire labor until she had her baby. So I would spend sometimes hours and hours a night long in the labor and delivery, sitting there and just writing and writing and writing and writing.
That's a story.
Interesting.
Very interesting. Yeah.
One final question from me, and then we'll open up to others if they have more questions, is if you were going to do this project again, self-publishing this project, what have you learned? What would you do differently, if anything, and why?
I don't think I'll do anything differently. As a matter of fact, that is my last published book, but not my last book. I've got another book that I've written since that one is done. I've shipped it off to that same editor. It's in their possession now. And they'll probably go to Amazon, I guess, when it's done. And I don't expect it's going to be read by a lot of people, but it's a book that I have done research on for more than 40 years.
What's the subject matter?
I'll tell you, I accumulated data and kept saving it. It is a biography of my father, who was an an unbelievable person, and I kept accumulating it, saying I've got to write this. And when I finished the book about Barbara, I thought, if I don't write this now, nobody will ever know the phenomenal things that he did. And so I wrote this book, and the writing of it is, the text is all done, it's in their possession now. And I've started writing another new book since I sent that off to her.
Okay, well, we'll look forward to the others, the ones yet to
They're
come.
not 850 pages long.
Okay. Yeah. Questions, comments for Herb? Yeah.
What is the cost involved in self-publishing?
What
The
did it cost you to self-publish?
Oh, it's insignificant. I pay for each copy of the book. I think I pay about $4 or $5 a book. There were some initial small fees, but it certainly was not an economic factor at all. It was just,
What did you pay the people though who
Oh, the editor.
edited that? Oh, yeah, that's
Oh,
that's
I
where
do.
the big cost is.
I do. I
Yeah.
paid them. I paid her $5,000 to
Okay.
read the book, reread the book, do the copy editing, do all the mechanics that were involved. But for me, $5,000 was worth it. I wanted people to know about Barbara.
Thank you.
Yeah,
And the writing of
Yeah.
it was very cathartic, extremely so.
other comments or questions? Karma?
Just a question again about your writing process. I mean, this huge volume of material that you get out is very impressive. So I'm wondering, do you edit as you go, or do you just spit it all out and then edit later?
Yeah, do you edit as you go, or just write it all out and then edit later?
I write it out and then I go back, keep going back and changing things. No specific number of times, but when I first start, I just write. I write. Now I know that when you read about people, just real authors who describe what the process is like, some of them will say, I write for 3-4 hours every day. I never let a day pass. Others say, no, I don't follow anything like that. I just write on a more casual basis. Most of the writing I've done over the years, I don't feel compelled that I must write every day. On that book, I mean, I turned out, as they said, almost 900 pages. I was writing every single day, but there was nothing else I was thinking about at all in the entire world, and so I just kept doing it. But otherwise, I go ahead with the rest of my life. Sometimes I won't write for a day or 2 or 3 or 4 and just do other things.
Yeah, right here.
I'd love to hear a part that, I'm sure you like it all, but the part that maybe your favorite, I don't know if there's such a thing as your favorite part. I'd love to hear you read it. Is
Yeah.
that
Do
possible?
you have a little section that's your favorite, that you like a lot, that you'd like to read?
Well, maybe a poem.
Yes, anything.
These poems were written at a time when,
Still need your microphone.
right?
Sorry.
Were written at a time when she was in great distress. As they say, she was under a lot of pressure from this first husband, and she would go through periods of saying, you know, that I know I've got to spend the rest of my life with you, to periods of saying, we have to end this because I can't stand what's happening to me here. At one point, she was almost on the verge of suicide from what was happening to her back home. So the poems are, some of them are silly and funny, because I like doing some of that kind of writing, but there was one where I think maybe it was one of the more difficult times of our relationship. To remember or to forget? Is it hard to remember long, lovely nights of ideas and dreams, of touching hands and lips and mouths that no one else will ever get? Of the ecstasy of two lovers entwined? No, more than that, two souls. Or rather, is it easier, or even possible to forget? Is it hard to remember music of every variety made even more lovely as every note was shared, and meals from the simplest to the most exotic where beneath the table two hands met, and the utter joy and silly laughter that occurred at some of the strangest times and some of the loveliest places? Or rather, is it easier or even possible to forget? Is it hard to remember quaint shops and streets of old Quebec and the glorious spectacle of those starry nights, and a day of love as we walked hand in hand while the ocean kissed our feet and made them saltly wet? Or that grand inspiration of finding a heaven on earth as we literally walked with God through her white snowy peaks? Or rather, is it easier or even possible to forget? Is it hard to remember the feeling the tap and soft shake and light kiss and tender sound of "It's time to get up, darling"? And see that precious cup you crave, from the smile on his face. There'll be another one yet. And but can't quite understand why he's even happier than you being there while you're drinking. Or rather, is it easier or even possible to forget? Is it hard to remember the plans that opened up the world to you in areas you never challenged before because he believed in you and you began to believe in yourself? Better yet, and the knowledge that someone not only loved you but liked you and had great respect for you as a person? Or rather, is it easier or even possible to forget? Is it hard to remember all the times when mental chores were gone together and somehow seemed like special events? Is it possible that shopping and cooking and just getting all the slides in order and set could really be so marvelous just because the person with you made you feel good about yourself? Or rather, is it easier or even possible to forget? Is it hard to remember being touched by hands moving in ways that said, "I love you" with every motion, or being brought to the highest peaks while knowing how much joy he had as he kissed, devoured, fondled, and pet? The end to be held so close, so very close, and hear the sighs of love given totally and freely? Or rather, is it easier or even possible to forget? Is it hard to remember a new kind of life without eggshells or feeling retaliation and rebuke? One in which you can be the person you want and say what you feel honestly, without regret, where feelings and emotions can be experienced and not hidden, and you are free to shine like the sun? Or rather, is it easier or even possible to forget? Is it hard to remember because time and habit draw you back, and it's so easy to seek security in the status quo? Can you then allow yourself to die wondering, because reaching out to something new is a risk and a threat, and with all that discard of love and sharing of minds more beautiful than most people will ever know? And will you really find it easier or even possible to forget?
Thank you. That was just lovely. And what a wonderful way to end our discussion. So thank you so much for being with us today. I appreciate you're driving all the way from San Antonio, is that right?
There are no places in the world that I love more than libraries and bookstores.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you for saying that. And thank you all for coming. Let's give Herb a nice round of applause.
Thank you.